Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Manhattan, Sotheby's auction house, Friday evening. The autumn rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows as New York's elite gathered for what was supposed to be a routine evening auction. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over perfectly coiffed heads and designer gowns, while white-gloved servers moved silently between rows of velvet chairs, refilling champagne flutes and offering imported canapés. Sophie Carter adjusted her vintage Cartier watch, a gift from her late grandmother and probably the most expensive thing she owned, and double-checked her notes one final time. As a freelance art authentication specialist, she'd built her reputation on being thorough, precise, and brutally honest. Tonight's lot included several pieces she'd personally examined, and she'd flagged concerns about item Sotheby's 47, a supposedly 1,920 seconds impressionist piece titled Garden Dreams. 3 rows ahead, Ethan Brooks fidgeted with his platinum cufflinks, his steel-gray eyes scanning the auction catalog without really seeing it. At 32, he'd inherited more money than most small countries' GDP, but tonight he felt like a fraud in his perfectly tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. His mother, Eleanor Brooks, philanthropist, socialite, and professional meddler, sat beside him, occasionally whispering the names of eligible daughters of family friends. The Langley girl just returned from Paris, Eleanor murmured behind her silk fan. Art history degree from the Sorbonne. Ethan barely grunted in response. His mind was elsewhere, specifically on the board meeting scheduled for Monday morning, where he'd have to explain why Brooks Enterprises' latest acquisition had fallen through again. The auctioneer, Henry Langston, a distinguished British gentleman who'd been moving millions of dollars worth of art for 3 decades, stepped up to the podium with practiced elegance. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's evening sale. We begin with lot number 1. The first 46 lots proceeded smoothly. Paintings, sculptures, and rare manuscripts changed hands with the fluid efficiency that only came with serious money. Sophie watched carefully, making mental notes about market trends and buyer behavior. She'd learned to read the room, the subtle nods, the almost imperceptible hand gestures, the way serious bidders kept their expressions carefully neutral. Then came lot number 47, Garden Dreams, attributed to Julian Moreau, circa 1921, Langston announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. A magnificent example of post-impressionist botanical work, oil on canvas, 36 by 24 inches. Bidding opens at $500,000. Sophie's stomach lurched. She'd examined that painting for 3 hours last Tuesday, using UV lights, magnification, and spectral analysis. The brushwork was wrong. The aging was artificial. Even the frame was a clever reproduction. She'd submitted her findings to Sotheby's authentication department, but apparently, her concerns had been overlooked. The bidding started conservatively. 500 became 600, then 800,000. Sophie watched Ethan Brooks from the corner of her eye. He was leaning forward slightly, his jaw set in concentration. She'd done her research on him. Who hadn't? Harvard MBA, heir to a shipping fortune, and currently locked in a very public feud with his board of directors, who thought he was too impulsive for his own good. 1.2 million, called a woman in emerald silk from the front row. 1.5, countered a silver-haired gentleman with a Texas accent. Ethan raised his paddle. 2 million. Sophie felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the air conditioning. This was getting out of hand fast. 2.5 million. The emerald silk woman shot back, not even turning around. The Texas gentleman shook his head and lowered his paddle, too rich for his blood. Ethan's mother placed a warning hand on his arm. Darling, perhaps 5 million, Ethan announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. Sophie stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the marble floor with an unfortunate screech. Every head in the vicinity turned toward her, including Ethan's. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room, and she saw something there. Desperation, maybe, or the reckless determination of someone with nothing left to lose. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $5 million from the gentleman in row 12. Do I hear 6 million? This is insane, Sophie muttered, clutching her authentication report. She couldn't just sit here and watch someone waste $5 million on a fake. It went against every professional instinct she had. The woman in emerald silk was conferring with her advisor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who was shaking his head emphatically. "Going once at $5 million," Langston called out, raising his gavel. Sophie's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it over the gentle hum of conversation. She had two choices: stay silent and watch a disaster unfold, or speak up and probably end her career in New York's art world. Sotheby's didn't appreciate being contradicted publicly. Going twice. Ethan Brooks was smiling now. The kind of confident smile that came with winning. His mother was fanning herself more vigorously, and Sophie could see other board members from Brooks Enterprises scattered throughout the audience, looking varying degrees of concerned and resigned. The gavel was starting its downward arc when Sophie made her decision. "Stop!" she shouted, jumping to her feet and pointing directly at Ethan. "That painting is a fake." The effect was immediate and devastating. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the servers stopped moving, frozen like mannequins in a department store window. Langston's gavel clattered to the floor. Forgotten. Ethan Brooks stared at her with a mixture of shock and something that might have been gratitude. The woman in emerald silk was openly gaping. Eleanor Brooks was frantically fanning herself, looking like she might faint at any moment. "I examined that piece personally," Sophie continued, her voice carrying in the absolute silence. "The paint composition is wrong for the period. The canvas preparation doesn't match Moreau's documented techniques, and the signature shows clear signs of artificial aging. It's a very good reproduction, but it's not authentic." Langston looked like a man watching his career flash before his eyes. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to—" "She's right." The voice came from the back of the room near the exit. An elderly man with a perfectly groomed white beard stepped forward, using a walking stick that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Dr. Edward Langley," he announced himself. "I've been collecting Moreau's work for 40 years, and I was Julian's personal friend before he died. That painting is indeed a fake, and a rather obvious one at that." The room erupted. Voices rose in confusion, anger, and excitement. Cell phones appeared as if by magic, probably already posting to social media. Sophie could practically see the headlines. Sotheby's scandal. Fake art rocks Manhattan elite. Authentication expert saves millionaire from disaster. In the midst of the chaos, Ethan Brooks was still staring at her, and then, as if the stress and adrenaline and sheer absurdity of the situation had short-circuited his brain, he stood up and said the first thing that popped into his head. "I love you." The words cut through the noise like a knife through butter. Every conversation stopped. Every phone camera turned toward him. Eleanor Brooks made a small whimpering sound and slumped against the woman next to her. Sophie Carter, who had faced down forgery rings, hostile auction houses, and intimidating collectors without flinching, felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Of all the possible responses to publicly saving someone from financial disaster, "I love you," had definitely not been on her list of expected outcomes. "You don't even know my name," she managed to say, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "Sophie Carter," Ethan replied immediately. "You graduated summa cum laude from NYU with degrees in art history and chemistry. You've consulted for the Met, the Whitney, and the Frick collection. You once exposed an entire gallery of fake Picassos in Soho. You drink your coffee iced even in winter. You have a cat named Renoir. And you're probably the most honest person in this entire room." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie blinked. Why do you know all that?" Ethan's confident expression faltered. "Because I've been trying to work up the courage to ask you out for 6 months. And I may have done some research, possibly too much research, definitely too much research." Eleanor Brooks chose that moment to fully faint. Sliding gracefully from her chair to the marble floor with a soft thud that somehow managed to be elegant, even in unconsciousness, Sophie looked at the chaos around her. The unconscious socialite, the stammering auctioneer, the room full of Manhattan's elite all staring at her with expressions ranging from amusement to scandalized delight, and muttered the only thing that seemed appropriate for the situation. "Well, darn it all to heck." Saturday morning, various locations. Sophie Carter woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing like an angry wasp against her nightstand. Without opening her eyes, she reached over and grabbed it, squinting at the screen through sleep-blurred vision. 47 missed calls, 63 text messages, and her email inbox showed 127 unread messages. Renoir. She groaned to the orange tabby cat perched on her windowsill. I think we're famous, and not the good kind of famous. The cat flicked his tail dismissively and went back to watching pigeons on the fire escape outside her tiny studio apartment. Sophie's place was a study in organized chaos. Art books stacked everywhere, authentication equipment taking up half her kitchen table, and reproductions of famous paintings covering every available wall space. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and the rent was almost manageable if she ate ramen 3 nights a week. She scrolled through her messages with growing horror. Sophie. Channel 7 News wants an interview. Claire, her only friend in the art world. Call me immediately. Daniel Henley, her sometimes client from the Whitney. Did you really save Ethan Brooks from buying a fake? Olivia, college roommate. The Post wants to do a feature story. Unknown number. Brooks Enterprises stock is up 12% this morning. Another unknown number. And then there were the ones that made her stomach sink. We need to talk. Monday, 9 a.m. Sharp Margaret Ashwood, Director of Authentication. Sotheby's. Your services will no longer be required, Edward Mills, private collector who'd been a regular client. Disappointed in your unprofessional behavior, Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, Department Head, Christie's. Sophie groaned and buried her face in her pillow. She'd saved a man from losing $5 million on a fake painting, and somehow she was the villain in this story. The art world was notoriously insular and unforgiving. Publicly contradicting Sotheby's was like slapping the Pope at Easter Mass. Her phone rang again. This time it was her mother. Sophie Catherine Carter, came the familiar voice from Sacramento. Your father just saw you on the morning news pointing at some man and yelling about art fraud. Are you in some kind of trouble? Hi, Mom. No, I'm not in trouble. I just did my job, sort of. Well, they're saying you embarrassed some very important people, and that this Brooks boy declared his love for you in front of everyone. Honey, is there something you haven't told us? Sophie sat up, running her free hand through her messy brown hair. Trust me, Mom, I had no idea he even knew who I was until last night. It was completely insane. He's very handsome, her mother said thoughtfully. Your father looked him up on the internet. Says he's worth about $2 billion. Mom, I'm just saying, dear, you're 31 years old. You work too much and you haven't brought anyone home for Christmas in 3 years. Maybe this is the universe telling you something. The universe is telling me to find a new career, Sophie muttered, scrolling through more angry emails. I think I just killed my professional reputation. Meanwhile, across the city in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, Ethan Brooks was having his own morning after crisis. He sat at his kitchen island, a marble slab that cost more than most people's cars, staring at his laptop screen and 3 different newspapers, all featuring variations of the same headline. Billionaire's public love declaration rocks Manhattan auction. The New York Post had gone with heart on the block above a photo of him looking like a deer in headlights. Page 6 had a zoomed-in shot of Sophie's shocked expression with the caption, Mystery Woman Saves Brooks Heir from Art Fraud. The Wall Street Journal, being more serious, had opted for Sotheby's authentication scandal exposes market vulnerabilities. His phone had been ringing nonstop since 6 a.m. His publicist wanted damage control. His lawyer wanted to discuss potential lawsuits. His mother wanted to know if she should plan a wedding or book therapy sessions. And worst of all, his board of directors wanted an emergency meeting to discuss his increasingly erratic behavior. Ethan's younger sister, Lily, breezed into the kitchen wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her blonde hair in a messy bun. At 28, she was the rebel of the Brooks family, an environmental lawyer who drove a hybrid and volunteered at animal shelters on weekends. Well, well, she said, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl and hopping onto the counter beside him. My big brother finally did something interesting. Tell me everything. There's nothing to tell. I had a momentary lapse of judgment and said something incredibly stupid in front of 200 people. You told a complete stranger you loved her after she saved you from buying a fake painting for $5 million, Lily said, taking a bite of her apple. That's not a lapse of judgment, Ethan. That's a romantic comedy. Ethan groaned and put his head in his hands. The board is going to crucify me. They already think I'm too impulsive to run the company. This is just going to prove their point. Maybe they have a point, Lily said gently. When was the last time you did something because you wanted to, not because it was expected of you? Before Ethan could answer, his housekeeper, Mrs. Liu, knocked on the kitchen door frame. "Mr. Brooks, there are reporters outside the building, and your mother called. She's on her way up." "Perfect," Ethan muttered. "Also," Mrs. Liu continued with a small smile, "there's a delivery for you. Flowers, I think." Lily raised an eyebrow. "Flowers from Sophie?" But when Mrs. Liu returned, she was carrying an enormous arrangement of white lilies with a card that read, "Our deepest condolences on the death of your dignity, the Board of Directors." Lily burst out laughing. Ethan, however, was not amused. "I need to fix this," he said, standing up and pacing to the window. "I need to apologize to Sophie Carter for dragging her into this mess, and I need to figure out how to convince my board that I'm not completely losing my mind." "Are you losing your mind?" Lily asked, watching him pace. Ethan stopped and considered the question seriously. "I don't know. Maybe. All I know is that when I saw her stand up in that room and risk her career to save me from making a massive mistake, Lily, she didn't even know me, and she was willing to torpedo her own professional reputation to do the right thing. When was the last time someone did something like that for you?" "Never," Lily admitted. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Ethan looked out at Central Park, where early morning joggers were making their way around the reservoir. Somewhere out there was Sophie Carter, probably dealing with her own crisis because of his impulsive declaration. "I'm going to find her," he said quietly, "and I'm going to apologize, and then I'm going to figure out how to make this right." His phone buzzed with yet another call. This time, it was his assistant. "Mr. Brooks, I have some interesting news. Sophie Carter just turned down interview requests from CNN, Good Morning America, and 60 Minutes. Her agent says she's not interested in capitalizing on the situation." Ethan felt something shift in his chest. In a city where people would sell their grandmother's jewelry for 15 minutes of fame, Sophie Carter was turning down major media opportunities. She really was as honest as he'd thought. "Also," his assistant continued, "Sotheby's has confirmed that the painting was indeed a fake, and they're launching an internal investigation into their authentication process. Dr. Langley has gone on record saying Miss Carter's intervention prevented a major scandal. So she was completely right." "Yes, sir. And sir, there's one more thing. I did some digging into Miss Carter's background like you asked. She's not just honest, she's broke. She turned down a very lucrative job at a private auction house last year because they wanted her to be less thorough in her authentications." Ethan closed his eyes. Sophie Carter had risked everything to save him from his own stupidity, and now she was probably paying the price for her integrity. "Cancel my morning appointments," he told his assistant. "I have someone I need to see." Lily grinned. "Now this is getting interesting." "And Lily," Ethan added, heading toward his bedroom to get dressed, "if Mom asks where I went, tell her I'm following my heart. She'll hate it, but at least she'll understand it." As he closed his bedroom door, Ethan could hear his sister laughing and already dialing someone's number, probably to share the latest development in what she dubbed Ethan's romantic comedy disaster. But for the first time in months, Ethan felt like he was doing something right. Now, he just had to figure out how to convince Sophie Carter not to slam the door in his face. Saturday afternoon, Sophie's studio apartment. Sophie was in the middle of stress-eating leftover Thai food straight from the container while researching job opportunities in Portland, far from New York's unforgiving art world, when someone knocked on her door. Not the gentle tap of her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Fernandez, or the rhythmic knock of the delivery guy from the bodega downstairs. This was a confident, purposeful knock that somehow managed to sound expensive. She peered through the peephole and nearly choked on her pad thai. Ethan Brooks stood in her hallway, looking impossibly handsome in dark jeans and a navy sweater that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He was holding what appeared to be coffee and a white paper bag, and most surprisingly, he looked nervous. Sophie glanced around her apartment in horror. Art books were scattered across every surface. Her authentication equipment was spread across the kitchen table like some sort of scientific crime scene, and she was wearing her rattiest jeans and a Columbia University sweatshirt with a hole in the left elbow. Her hair was in a messy ponytail secured with what might have been a paintbrush. She considered pretending she wasn't home, but Renoir chose that moment to meow loudly and paw at the door, apparently curious about their visitor. Ethan knocked again. "Sophie, I know you're in there. I can hear your cat, and I saw you look through the peephole. How do you know where I live? She called through the door, not moving to unlock it. Your address is listed in the professional directory. And before you ask, I didn't bring reporters or photographers or anyone else. It's just me. And coffee. I brought coffee. Sophie closed her eyes and counted to 10, then 20, then 30. But Ethan Brooks was apparently patient because he just waited. Finally, against her better judgment, she opened the door, but left the chain latch engaged, creating a gap just wide enough to glare at him through. Mr. Brooks, she said formally, this is unexpected. Ethan. He corrected gently. And I know this is probably the last thing you want to deal with right now, but I needed to apologize and to thank you, and to make sure you're okay. Sophie studied his face through the gap. He did look genuinely concerned, and those steel-gray eyes that had stared at her across the auction room now seemed almost vulnerable. I'm fine, she lied. Just peachy. My career might be over, but other than that, everything's wonderful. Ethan winced. That's actually why I'm here. Can I come in, please? I promise I'm not here to declare my love again or do anything else embarrassing. I just want to talk. Against every instinct screaming at her to send him away, Sophie found herself unlatching the chain and opening the door wider. 5 minutes, she said. And only because you brought coffee. Ethan stepped into her tiny studio and looked around with genuine interest. Not the polite curiosity she'd expected from someone who probably lived in a penthouse. His gaze lingered on her makeshift workspace, her art book collection, and a reproduction of Van Gogh's Starry Night that she'd painted herself in college. You painted that? He asked, nodding toward the Van Gogh. It's just a copy. I was an art student before I switched to authentication. Sophie took the coffee he offered. It was from Joe Coffee, her favorite place that she couldn't afford anymore. How did you know I liked this place? Ethan had the grace to look embarrassed. I may have observed your coffee habits during the 3 months I've been trying to work up the courage to introduce myself at various gallery events. 3 months? Sophie stared at him. You said 6 months last night. 6 months of noticing you. 3 months of actively trying to approach you and chickening out every time. Ethan ran a hand through his dark hair, making it stick up slightly. I'm not usually this pathetic in business meetings. I'm actually quite confident. Despite everything, Sophie felt the corner of her mouth twitch. What stopped you from introducing yourself? You, Ethan said simply. Every time I saw you work, you were so focused, passionate. You'd examine a piece like you were solving a mystery, completely absorbed in your work. You never seemed to notice all the gallery donors trying to schmooze you or the collectors trying to get your attention. You just cared about the art. It was... He paused, searching for words. It was beautiful to watch. Sophie felt heat creep up her neck. She wasn't used to compliments, especially not from billionaires standing in her messy apartment. Mr. Brooks, Ethan, you didn't come here just to tell me you've been stalking me for 6 months, did you? Ethan laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his whole face. When you put it like that, it does sound rather creepy. No, I came here because what happened last night was my fault, and I wanted to fix it. He reached into the white paper bag and pulled out what appeared to be a folder. This is a contract. Sophie's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. A what now? Brooks Enterprises needs a director of art authentication and acquisition. Someone to oversee our corporate collection, authenticate pieces for our foundations, and advise on art investments. The salary is 3 times what you made freelancing last year, full benefits, and complete autonomy over all authentication decisions. Sophie stared at him. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you the job you deserve, one where your integrity is an asset, not a liability. Ethan set the folder on her kitchen table, carefully moving aside a magnifying glass and some chemical testing strips. You saved me from making a $5 million mistake last night. The board might think I'm impulsive, but they can't argue with results. This is crazy, Sophie said, but she found herself opening the folder anyway. The salary figure made her eyes widen. This is more money than I've made in the last 3 years combined. You're worth it, Ethan said quietly. And Sophie, there are no strings attached. You take this job, you report to me professionally, but I won't bother you personally. Last night I was caught up in the moment. You don't have to worry about me making things awkward." Sophie looked up from the contract. Ethan was standing by her window now, hands in his pockets, watching Renoir investigate his shoes. There was something almost lonely about his posture, despite his confident words. "Why?" she asked. "And don't tell me it's just because I saved you money. You could hire any authentication expert in the world." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, still looking out the window at the view of the building across the street, a far cry from his Central Park panorama. "Because," he said finally, "in a room full of people who would have let me make that mistake just to avoid causing a scene, you stood up and did the right thing. Even though it cost you. In my world, that kind of honesty is rarer than any painting." Sophie felt something flutter in her chest, which was dangerous. She couldn't afford to be charmed by Ethan Brooks, no matter how sincere he seemed. Men like him lived in a different universe, one with private jets and charity galas and problems that could be solved by throwing money at them. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course." Ethan headed toward the door, then paused. "Sophie, for what it's worth, I meant what I said last night. Not the timing, obviously. That was terrible. But the sentiment." He smiled, that same confident smile that had gotten him into trouble at the auction. "I've been half in love with you since the first time I watched you authenticate a Degas with such concentration that you didn't notice the fire alarm going off." "The fire alarm?" Sophie blinked. "That was you at the Frick Collection benefit?" "I always wondered why everyone had evacuated except the security guard and some guy in a tux. Turned out to be a false alarm. Something about the kitchen smoke detectors. But you just kept working, completely oblivious." Ethan's grin widened. "That's when I knew I was in trouble." After he left, Sophie sat on her tiny couch with Renoir purring in her lap and the contract spread out on her coffee table. The job offer was incredible, more than incredible. It would solve all her financial problems and give her the professional respect she'd been craving. But it would also mean working for the man who declared his love for her in front of half of Manhattan's social elite, the man who, despite his obvious wealth and privilege, had somehow managed to make her apartment feel less lonely just by standing in it for 10 minutes. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lily Brooks. Apparently, Ethan's sister had gotten her number somehow. "My brother is an idiot, but he's a well-meaning idiot. Also, he's been driving our entire family crazy, talking about the brilliant woman who authenticates art like she's solving crimes. Just thought you should know, Lily." Sophie stared at the message, then at the contract, then at Renoir, who offered no helpful advice beyond demanding to be fed. "What do you think, Renoir?" she asked. "Should I take a job from a man who's been secretly watching me work for 6 months?" Renoir just purred louder. Through her window, Sophie could see the sun setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have made the Impressionists weep. Somewhere out there, Ethan Brooks was probably dealing with his own crisis. Board meetings and family expectations and the weight of $1 billion company on his shoulders. And somewhere in between her student loan payments and his corporate responsibilities, something unexpected had sparked to life in a Sotheby's auction room. Sophie picked up the contract and started reading it again. This time, she paid attention to every single detail. Because Ethan Brooks might be impulsive and privileged and completely outside her league. But he was also right about one thing. In her world, honesty was everything. And something told her that despite last night's disaster, he might just be worth the risk. Monday morning, Brooks Enterprises headquarters, Manhattan. Sophie stood on the sidewalk outside the gleaming 40-story Brooks Enterprises tower, clutching her new leather portfolio, a weekend purchase that had made her credit card weep, and questioning every life decision that had led her to this moment. The building stretched toward the sky like a monument to capitalism, all glass and steel and intimidating corporate power. Business people in expensive suits flowed around her like a river of ambition, everyone seeming to know exactly where they belonged. She did not belong here. After 48 hours of agonizing pros and cons lists and a lengthy phone conversation with her parents, "Take the job, sweetie. You can figure out the romance part later." Sophie had signed the contract at 11:47 p.m. Sunday night. Now, standing in the shadow of Ethan's corporate empire, she was having serious second thoughts. Her phone buzzed with a text from Claire, her friend from the art world. "Saw you on page 6 this morning. Mystery art expert joins Brooks Enterprises. How does it feel to be Manhattan's most talked-about new hire?" Sophie groaned. She'd specifically asked Ethan's publicist apparently. She had a publicist now. which was terrifying to keep the announcement low-key. Clearly, low-key meant different things to different people. Taking a deep breath that tasted like exhaust fumes and ambition, Sophie pushed through the revolving doors into the marble and mahogany lobby. The receptionist, a polished woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, smiled with the kind of professional warmth that probably came with extensive training. "You must be Miss Carter," she said before Sophie could introduce herself. "Mr. Brooks is expecting you. Top floor, executive elevator bank. Just show your ID to security." The security checkpoint was more thorough than most airports, but eventually, Sophie found herself alone in an elevator that rose so smoothly she barely felt the movement. Classical music played softly as floor numbers ticked by, and Sophie caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. She'd chosen her most professional outfit, a navy blazer, white blouse, and black slacks that she'd owned since graduate school. But next to all the designer suits she'd seen in the lobby, she felt like she was wearing a costume from the clearance rack. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area that looked like it belonged in a museum. Original paintings lined the walls. She spotted what looked like a genuine Renoir water lily study and nearly stopped breathing. And the furniture was the kind of sleek modern pieces that cost more than cars. Miss Carter. A woman in her 50 approached with a warm smile and an aura of competent authority. "I'm Laura Winters, Mr. Brooks's executive assistant. Welcome to Brooks Enterprises." Laura led her through a maze of offices and conference rooms, pointing out various departments and explaining the company's structure. Brooks Enterprises, Sophie learned, was more than just a shipping company. They had divisions in real estate, renewable energy technology, and, most relevant to her new position, an extensive philanthropic arm that included several art foundations. The corporate art collection is housed on floors 37 through 39, Laura explained as they walked. Brooks's father started collecting in the 1982nd, and it's grown significantly since then. You'll have your own authentication lab on 38 and a team of 3 research assistants. Sophie nearly stumbled. "A team?" "Of course. Did Mr. Brooks not mention? You'll be overseeing the authentication of all new acquisitions, managing the existing collection, and consulting on pieces being considered for donation or sale. It's quite a significant operation." They stopped outside a door with a brass nameplate that read, "Sophie Carter, Director of Art Authentication and Acquisition." Sophie stared at it for a long moment, feeling like she was in someone else's life. Her office was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, built-in bookshelves already stocked with art history references, and a desk that was probably worth more than her entire previous year's income. But what made her breath catch was the easel in the corner, set up with professional lighting and a magnifying system. "Mr. Brooks thought you might appreciate having workspace for detailed examinations," Laura said, noticing her reaction. He was quite specific about the lighting requirements. Sophie ran her fingers along the easel's adjustment mechanisms. It was exactly the kind of setup she'd dreamed of having but never been able to afford. Ethan had clearly done his research on what she needed to do her job properly. "There's one more thing," Laura said, checking her watch. "Mr. Brooks would like to see you in his office at 10 for your orientation meeting. That gives you about 30 minutes to settle in." After Laura left, Sophie explored her new domain with growing amazement. The adjoining lab space contained equipment she'd only dreamed of using. Spectral analysis machines, high-resolution cameras, chemical testing stations, and reference libraries that most museums would envy. Everything was state-of-the-art and clearly chosen by someone who understood the technical requirements of art authentication. At exactly 10, she knocked on Ethan's office door. "Come in," came his voice from inside. Ethan's office was impressive but surprisingly personal. Yes, there was the expected massive desk and conference table, the wall of windows with a view that probably cost more per square foot than most people's entire apartments. But there were also family photos scattered around. Ethan with Lily at what looked like a hiking trip, an older couple who were probably his parents at some formal event, and several pictures of what appeared to be company charitable events. Ethan himself was standing by the windows, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly and made him look every inch the corporate executive. But when he turned to greet her, Sophie saw the same nervous energy she'd noticed in her apartment. "Sophie," he said, his face lighting up with what seemed like genuine relief. "You came." "Well, I did sign a contract," she said, trying to keep things professional. despite the way her pulse quickened when he smiled at her like that. "How do you like your office? If there's anything else you need for the lab, just let Laura know. I want to make sure you have everything necessary to do your job properly." Sophie moved to stand beside him at the windows, looking out over the city sprawling below them. From this height, the people on the streets looked like ants, and the traffic seemed almost peaceful. "Ethan, can I ask you something?" she said, still looking out at the view. "Anything. Why is this job so important to you? I mean, beyond just hiring good people, you could have contracted with any authentication firm in the city. Why create an entire department for one person?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, and when Sophie glanced at him, she saw that he was studying her profile with an intensity that made her skin warm. "Do you know how my father built this company?" he asked finally. Sophie shook her head. "He started with one cargo ship and a willingness to take risks that other shipping companies wouldn't take. He transported art and antiquities for museums and collectors when everyone else was focused on bulk cargo. He said that art was civilization's memory, and protecting it was more important than profit margins." Ethan moved to his desk and picked up a framed photograph. A man who looked like an older version of Ethan standing next to a ship loaded with carefully crated artwork. "He died when I was 25. Ethan continued. "I just finished my MBA and thought I knew everything about running a business. The board wanted me to focus on the profitable divisions, shipping, real estate, tech. They thought the art foundations were sentimental nonsense, but you kept them. I expanded them because my father was right. Art is civilization's memory, and if we don't protect it, authenticate it properly, preserve it for future generations, then what's the point of all this?" He gestured around the office, encompassing the entire corporate empire spread out below them. Sophie felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about hiring her. It was about Ethan honoring his father's legacy while proving he was more than just an impulsive rich kid. "The board still thinks I'm too sentimental," Ethan said with a wry smile. "They'd rather I focus on quarterly profits and stock prices. But last Friday night, when you stood up in that auction room and risked your career to prevent a fraud, you proved that some things matter more than money. That's exactly the kind of integrity this company needs." Before Sophie could respond, Ethan's assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Brooks, the board meeting starts in 5 minutes. Ethan's expression immediately shifted, becoming more guarded. "Right. The emergency session about my increasingly erratic behavior, because of Friday night. Because of Friday night. Because of hiring you. Because of what they see as my general tendency to follow my instincts instead of their committees and focus groups." Ethan straightened his tie and picked up a thick folder from his desk. "They've been looking for an excuse to remove me as CEO for months. My public declaration of love for a woman I'd never officially met just gave them the ammunition they needed." Sophie felt a stab of guilt. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I never meant for you to—" "Don't apologize," Ethan said firmly. "I meant every word I said Friday night. Maybe not the timing, but the sentiment. And hiring you was the smartest business decision I've made in months, regardless of my personal feelings." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sophie, there's something else you should know. The board is going to want to meet you. They're going to question your qualifications, your experience, and probably your motives for taking this job. Some of them think I hired you because of Friday night, not because of your professional abilities." Sophie felt her spine straighten. "Let them question me. I've spent my entire career proving I belong in rooms full of people who think I don't deserve to be there." Ethan's smile was brilliant. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." After Ethan left for his board meeting, Sophie spent the morning exploring the corporate art collection. It was impressive. 3 floors of carefully curated pieces spanning centuries and styles. She found works by Picasso, Rothko, and O'Keeffe alongside lesser-known pieces that showed real curatorial vision. Someone with excellent taste had built this collection, and it was clear that it was more than just a corporate tax write-off. She was examining a small sketch that might have been a previously unknown study for a famous Degas painting when her research team arrived. Rachel Morrison was a recent PhD in art history from Columbia, enthusiastic and sharp-eyed. Nathan Chen had a master's degree in chemistry and specialized in paint analysis. And Michael Fitzgerald was a former FBI agent who'd specialized in art crimes before moving into the private sector. "Miss Carter," Rachel said tentatively. "We wanted to introduce ourselves and see if you needed anything to get started." Sophie looked at the three of them, young, professional, clearly competent, and realized that she was their boss. She was responsible for their work, their careers, their professional development. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "Please call me Sophie," she said. "And yes, there's definitely something you can help me with. I want to do a complete inventory and reauthentication of the entire collection, everything from provenance research to technical analysis." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Everything? There are over 300 pieces in the collection." "I know it's a big project, but if we're going to build Brooks Enterprises' reputation as a leader in art authentication, we need to make sure our own house is in order first." Sophie pulled up the collection database on her tablet. "Besides, I have a feeling that if Ethan's board is looking for reasons to question his judgment, they might start by questioning his recent hire. I want to make sure that when they do, we have data to back up every decision we make." They spent the rest of the morning developing a systematic approach to the inventory project. Sophie found herself energized by the collaborative process. After years of working alone, having a team to bounce ideas off was a luxury she hadn't expected. At noon, Laura appeared with lunch and an update. "The board meeting is still going on, Mr. Brooks asked me to tell you not to wait for him and that he'll catch up with you later this afternoon." Sophie ate her sandwich while reviewing provenance documents for a supposedly 18th century landscape, but her mind kept drifting to Ethan facing down his board of directors. She could imagine him in that conference room, defending his decisions with the same passionate conviction he'd shown when talking about his father's legacy. Around 2, Lily Brooks appeared in Sophie's doorway, wearing jeans and a blazer that somehow managed to look both casual and professional. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Lily said, glancing around the office with obvious approval. "I wanted to welcome you to the family business and see how you were settling in." "It's beautiful," Sophie said honestly, "though I'm still not entirely sure I belong here." Lily laughed, settling into one of the chairs across from Sophie's desk. "Trust me, half the people in this building feel the same way. Corporate environments can be intimidating, especially when you're used to working independently. Ethan mentioned you're an environmental lawyer. Environmental law and corporate responsibility. I work with the Brooks Foundation on sustainability initiatives." Lily's expression grew more serious. "Sophie, can I be direct with you about something?" Sophie nodded, though she braced herself for whatever was coming. "My brother has been different since Friday night. Happier, I think, more focused. For months, he's been going through the motions, showing up to meetings, making decisions, but not really engaged with any of it. The board has been pushing him to be more conservative, more traditional, and it's been slowly killing his enthusiasm for the company." Lily leaned forward in her chair. "But hiring you, creating this position, it's the first time in months that I've seen him excited about something. And from what I can tell, you're exactly what this place needs. Someone who cares more about doing the right thing than about politics or profit margins. Lily, I need you to know that I didn't take this job because of what happened Friday night. I took it because it's an incredible opportunity and because Ethan convinced me that he's serious about building something meaningful here." "I know that," Lily said with a smile, "and I think Ethan knows that too, even if he's too nervous to trust it completely. But Sophie, the board doesn't know that, and some of them are going to try to use your appointment as evidence that Ethan isn't thinking clearly." Before Sophie could ask what that meant, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Board meeting concluded. We need to talk. My office, 3 p.m. Ethan." Sophie showed the message to Lily, who winced. "That doesn't sound good," Lily said. "No," Sophie agreed, checking her watch. "It really doesn't." As Lily left, Sophie tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept spinning with possibilities. Had the board decided to fire Ethan? Had they demanded he rescind her job offer? Had they found some way to use Friday night's incident to justify more drastic action? At exactly 3, Sophie knocked on Ethan's office door again. This time, when he called for her to come in, his voice sounded strained. Ethan was standing behind his desk, still in his suit, but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it. His expression was carefully neutral, but Sophie could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "How was the board meeting?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the afternoon sun reflecting off the surrounding buildings. "They want to meet you," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Full board presentation about your qualifications, your vision for the art authentication department, and your plans for integrating with the company's broader strategic goals." Sophie felt her stomach drop. "That sounds like they're looking for reasons to undermine my decision to hire you." "Yes, that's exactly what at Island." Ethan finally looked at her, and Sophie saw frustration and something that might have been fear in his expression. "Sophie, I need you to know that this isn't about your qualifications. You're overqualified for this position, and anyone with half a brain can see that. This is about the board's perception that I'm making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Because you hired the woman you declared your love for. Because I hired the woman I declared my love for without consulting them first. Yes." Ethan sat down heavily in his chair. "The truth is, they've been looking for an excuse to question my leadership for months. My father ran this company by instinct and intuition, but the board wants data and committee approval for every decision. They think I'm too much like him." Sophie studied his face, seeing the weight of expectation and legacy pressing down on him. "Ethan, do you want me to resign? If my being here is making things harder for you?" "No," Ethan said immediately, leaning forward in his chair. "Sophie, no, don't even think about that. What I want is for you to walk into that boardroom tomorrow morning and show them exactly why I hired you. Show them that you're not just qualified, you're essential. Show them that art authentication isn't just about preventing fraud. It's about preserving cultural heritage and building the company's reputation as a leader in ethical business practices." Sophie felt a flutter of nerves mixed with determination. "And if I can't convince them?" Ethan's smile was rueful but determined. "Then we'll both be looking for new jobs by Friday." Outside Ethan's office windows, the sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the city below, people were heading home from work, worrying about normal things like dinner plans and weekend activities. But in the 40-story tower of Brooks Enterprises, Sophie Carter was preparing for the most important presentation of her career, one that could determine not just her future, but the future of the man who'd risked everything to give her a chance. As she gathered her things to leave for the day, Ethan called her name. "Sophie, for what it's worth, I don't regret anything that happened Friday night. Not the auction, not hiring you. Not even the part where I made a complete fool of myself in front of half of Manhattan." Sophie paused at his office door, looking back at him sitting behind his massive desk, surrounded by the trappings of corporate power, but somehow looking younger and more vulnerable than any billionaire CEO had a right to look. "Ethan, for what it's worth, I don't regret it either." The smile he gave her was worth all the board meetings in the world. Tuesday morning, Brooks Enterprises Executive Conference Room. Sophie stood outside the boardroom at 8:45 a.m., holding her presentation materials and trying to calm her racing heart. Through the frosted glass doors, she could see shadows moving around the massive conference table. 12 board members who held Ethan's professional future in their hands, and now hers as well. She'd spent most of the previous evening preparing with help from an unexpected source. Lily had shown up at her apartment around 7, with takeout Chinese food and insider knowledge about each board member's personality, background, and potential concerns. Helen Ramsey is the toughest, Lily had warned while they spread presentation notes across Sophie's tiny kitchen table. She's been on the board since Dad died, and she thinks Ethan is too young and too emotional to run the company. She'll ask the hardest questions, but if you win her over, the others will follow. "What about William Liu?" Sophie had asked, scanning her notes about the board's composition. Uncle William not actually related, but Dad's oldest friend. He founded Lou Williams Financial Group and basically taught Ethan everything he knows about business strategy. He's fair, but practical. Show him solid numbers and clear ROI projections, and he'll support you. Now, standing outside the boardroom in her best black suit, borrowed from Lily, who was apparently the same size and had much better taste in professional wear, Sophie reviewed her strategy one more time. She'd structured her presentation around 3 key points: the financial value of proper art authentication, Brooks Enterprises' opportunity to become an industry leader in ethical collecting practices, and the long-term reputational benefits of having world-class expertise in-house. The boardroom doors opened, and Laura Winters appeared. "They're ready for you, miss? Carter," she said with an encouraging smile. "Remember, you belong here." Sophie entered the room and immediately understood why corporate executives found board meetings intimidating. The conference room was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a polished mahogany table that could probably seat 20 people, and leather chairs that looked like they cost more than most people's cars. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her as she entered, representing decades of business experience and billions of dollars in collective wealth. At the head of the table sat Helen Ramsey, a silver-haired woman in her 60s, who radiated the kind of authority that came from 40 years of boardroom battles. To her right was William Liu, distinguished and alert, studying Sophie with obvious curiosity. The other board members represented a mix of ages, backgrounds, and specialties: finance, real estate, shipping, technology, but they all shared the same expression of polite skepticism. Ethan sat at the opposite end of the table from Helen, and when Sophie caught his eye, he gave her the slightest nod of encouragement. Lily was seated along the sidewall in one of the observer chairs, officially there as a foundation representative, but clearly providing moral support. "Miss Carter," Helen said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Please have a seat. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us this morning." Sophie settled into the chair at the center of the table, directly across from where Ethan Saturday. She placed her presentation materials in front of her and looked around the room, making eye contact with each board member. "Thank you for having me," she said, pleased that her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I'm excited to share my vision for Brooks Enterprises' art authentication program and how it can contribute to the company's broader strategic goals." "Before we begin," interrupted a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses whom Sophie recognized as Charles Whitmore, the company's chief financial officer, "I think we should address the elephant in the room. Miss Carter, are you aware that your appointment has generated significant media attention? Much of it focused on the unusual circumstances under which you met Mr. Brooks." Sophie had been expecting this question, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. Around the table, she could see various expressions, some sympathetic, others calculating, and a few that looked openly hostile. "I'm aware of the media coverage," Sophie said carefully. "I'm also aware that some people might question whether my professional qualifications were the primary factor in my hiring. I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll agree that my credentials speak for themselves." Helen leaned forward slightly. "Miss Carter, you have an impressive academic background and excellent references from several prestigious institutions. However, you've never run a corporate department before, never managed a team, and never worked within a large organization's structure. What makes you think you can handle the responsibilities of this position?" Sophie had anticipated this question too, and she answered with confidence. "You're absolutely right that I haven't worked in a corporate environment before, but I have managed complex projects involving multiple stakeholders, tight deadlines, and high-value assets. When I authenticated the Langley collection for the Metropolitan Museum last year, I coordinated with curators, insurance companies, legal teams, and international shipping specialists to verify and catalog over 200 pieces worth a combined value of $50 million. The project came in under budget and ahead of schedule." She opened her portfolio and pulled out a bound report. "I've prepared a detailed analysis of how those same project management skills will translate to Brooks Enterprises' needs. More importantly, I've identified several areas where our authentication program can generate direct revenue and cost savings for the company." William Liu looked intrigued. "Revenue generation? How so?" Sophie stood and moved to the room's presentation screen, connecting her laptop with practiced efficiency. Her first slide appeared, a clean, professional layout with the Brooks Enterprises logo and the title, "Art Authentication as Strategic Business Advantage." Brooks Enterprises currently maintains insurance on your corporate art collection valued at approximately $80 million, Sophie began, clicking to her next slide, which showed a breakdown of the collection's assessed value. "However, my preliminary review suggests that several pieces may be significantly undervalued, while others might be overinsured based on questionable attributions." She clicked again, and a detailed analysis appeared. "For example, There's a small landscape in the 37th floor conference room that's currently insured as a minor 19th century work worth approximately $50,000. Based on brushwork analysis and provenance research, I believe it's actually an early study by Winslow Homer, which would make it worth closer to $2 million. Helen's eyebrows rose. You're suggesting we have a $2 million painting that we didn't know about? I'm suggesting we have several pieces that haven't been properly evaluated in years, Sophie corrected. On the flip side, there's a supposed Renoir water lily study in the executive dining room that I suspect is actually a very good period copy. If I'm right, we're paying insurance premiums on a $15 million painting that's actually worth about $50,000. She clicked to the next slide, showing projected cost savings and revenue opportunities. Proper authentication and revaluation of the entire collection could save the company approximately $300,000 annually in insurance costs, while potentially identifying assets worth significantly more than currently assessed. Charles Whitmore was taking notes now, his earlier skepticism replaced by obvious interest. What about authentication services for clients? Could this become a profit center? Sophie smiled. This was exactly the direction she'd hoped the conversation would take. Brooks Enterprises already has an excellent reputation in the art world through your shipping and logistics services. Adding authenticated expertise creates opportunities for fee-based consultation, which typically runs between 5 and 15% of a piece's value. If we authenticated just 10 major pieces per year for external clients, we could generate between $500,000 and $2 million in additional revenue. She clicked to her next slide, which showed case studies from other companies that had developed similar in-house capabilities. More importantly, this positions Brooks Enterprises as a leader in ethical art dealing. With increasing scrutiny around provenance and authenticity in the art world, companies that can guarantee proper authentication have a significant competitive advantage. Tell us about your team, said a woman Sophie recognized as Dr. Catherine Barnes, who sat on the boards of several major nonprofits. How do you plan to build and manage a department that can handle this scope of work? Sophie clicked to a slide showing her organizational chart. I've already begun working with 3 research specialists: Rachel Morrison, who brings academic expertise in art history; Nathan Chen, who handles technical analysis and paint chemistry; and Michael Fitzgerald, who specializes in provenance research and has extensive experience with art crime investigation. She paused, making eye contact with several board members. But more than individual expertise, we're building a collaborative approach that leverages Brooks Enterprises' existing strengths. Our authentication work will integrate with your logistics team for secure transport, your legal department for provenance verification, and your technology division for digital archiving and analysis. Helen leaned back in her chair, studying Sophie with what might have been approval. You've clearly done your homework, Miss Carter, but let me ask you something more personal. This is a family company built on relationships and trust. Ethan has taken a considerable risk in creating this position and hiring you. If this doesn't work out, if the media attention becomes problematic, if clients question your appointment, if the board decides this was a mistake, how do we know you won't simply walk away when things get difficult? The room fell silent. Sophie could feel every eye on her, including Ethan's. This was the real test, not her technical qualifications or her business plan, but whether she was committed to seeing this through regardless of the challenges. Sophie thought about her tiny studio apartment, her student loans, her years of struggling to build credibility in a field dominated by wealthy collectors and institutional gatekeepers. She thought about Ethan's father's vision of art as civilization's memory, and about the opportunity to build something meaningful rather than just profitable. Miss Ramsey, she said finally, I grew up in Sacramento, where my father taught high school history and my mother worked as a librarian. I paid my way through college and graduate school, and I've spent the last 8 years building my reputation, one authentication at a time, often working for clients who paid late and treated me as disposable. She gestured around the boardroom. This opportunity to work with world-class resources, to build a team, to contribute to something larger than just individual projects, this is everything I've worked toward my entire career. You're asking if I'll walk away when things get difficult? I can promise you that won't happen. I don't have a trust fund to fall back on or family connections to open doors. This job isn't just an opportunity for me. It's the culmination of everything I've worked for. I'm not going anywhere. The silence that followed was profound. Sophie could hear the subtle hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. William Liu was the first to speak. "Ethan, you mentioned that Miss Carter prevented you from making a significant error at the Sotheby's auction. Can you elaborate on that?" Ethan straightened in his chair, and Sophie could see him shifting into business mode. "The painting I was bidding on, Garden Dreams, supposedly by Julian Moreau, was being sold with a letter of authenticity from a respected dealer. The auction house had approved it for sale. Every expert who had examined it had signed off on its provenance. Sophie identified it as a fake within minutes of seeing it offered for sale." "How?" asked Dr. Barnes. Sophie answered before Ethan could. The brushwork was inconsistent with Moreau's documented technique during that period. The paint composition included synthetic pigments that weren't available until the 1940 seconds, and the aging patterns were artificially induced rather than natural deterioration. Most importantly, Ethan added, Sophie was willing to risk her professional reputation to prevent fraud, even though she had no personal obligation to do so. That kind of integrity is exactly what Brooks Enterprises needs in this role. Helen tapped her pen against her notepad. "Miss Carter, if we approve this appointment, what would you say is your primary goal for the first year?" "3 things, Sophie said without hesitation. "First, complete a comprehensive authentication and revaluation of the existing corporate collection, which will give us a solid foundation and likely generate immediate cost savings. Second, establish Brooks Enterprises as a trusted name in authentication services, which means building relationships with museums, galleries, and private collectors. Third, create systems and protocols that ensure every piece of art associated with this company, whether in our collection, being transported for clients, or donated through the foundations, meets the highest standards of authenticity and ethical provenance." "And if you discover that some of our current holdings are problematic?" asked Charles Whitmore. "Forgeries, pieces with questionable provenance, works that might have been looted or stolen." Sophie met his gaze directly. "Then we deal with it transparently and ethically. We work with appropriate authorities to return stolen works to their rightful owners. We remove forgeries from the collection, and we use each case as an opportunity to demonstrate Brooks Enterprises' commitment to doing the right thing, even when it's costly." Lily spoke up from her observer chair. "Sophie, can you talk about how this fits with the Brooks Foundation's mission and values?" Sophie nodded, grateful for the opportunity to address the company's philanthropic work. "Art authentication directly supports the Foundation's goal of preserving cultural heritage for future generations. When we ensure that donated works are authentic, we protect the reputation of receiving institutions. When we identify and return stolen artifacts, we help heal historical wounds. When we educate people about proper authentication, we help prevent future fraud." She clicked to her final slide, which showed a timeline for implementing her proposed programs. "More specifically, I'd like to propose that Brooks Enterprises establish an annual authentication fellowship, a program that would bring emerging scholars and conservators to work with our team, providing them with hands-on experience while building relationships with the next generation of art world professionals." Helen looked around the table at her fellow board members, then back at Sophie. "Miss Carter, thank you for a very thorough presentation. We'd like to discuss your proposals privately, and we'll have an answer for you by the end of the day." Sophie gathered her materials, shook hands with each board member, and headed for the door. As she reached it, Helen called her name. "Miss Carter, off the record, that was impressive. Regardless of how we vote today, you should know that you've answered every question I had about your qualifications." In the hallway outside the boardroom, Sophie felt her knees go weak with relief. Lily appeared beside her, grinning broadly. "That was amazing," Lily said, linking her arm through Sophie's. "I've never seen anyone handle Helen Ramsey that effectively. She actually smiled when you talked about returning stolen artifacts." "Do you think it went well?" Sophie asked, still feeling the adrenaline from the presentation. "I think you just gave the best board presentation in Brooks Enterprises history," Lily said. "Come on, let's get coffee while they deliberate. Ethan will meet us when they're done." They spent the next 2 hours in the company cafeteria, with Lily sharing stories about growing up in the Brooks family and Sophie gradually beginning to believe that she might actually belong in this world. Around noon, Ethan appeared, his expression unreadable. "Well?" Sophie asked, her heart hammering. Ethan's face broke into a grin. Unanimous approval. Helen said it was the most impressive presentation she'd seen in 20 years of board meetings. William wants to discuss setting up a consulting arrangement with his own art collection, and Charles is already working on budget projections for the Authentication Fellowship program. Sophie felt tears of relief prick her eyes. Really? Really? Welcome to Brooks Enterprises, Director Carter, for real this time. Lily cheered and hugged them both. Other employees in the cafeteria looked over curiously, but Sophie didn't care. She'd done it. She'd proven herself in the boardroom and earned her place in Ethan's world through her own merits. But as Ethan's hand lingered on her shoulder during Lily's celebratory hug, Sophie realized that the hardest part might still be ahead of her, because now that the professional questions were settled, she had to figure out what to do about the personal ones, starting with the fact that she was definitely, completely, and probably hopelessly falling for her boss. Later that afternoon, Sophie was in her office reviewing authentication protocols when Ethan knocked on her door. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Always," Sophie said, gesturing for him to sit down. Instead, Ethan walked to her windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sophie, I need to tell you something," he said finally. "This morning before the board meeting, Helen Ramsey cornered me in my office." Sophie felt her stomach clench. "What did she say?" "She asked me if I was in love with you." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sophie's mouth went dry. "What did you tell her?" she managed to ask. Ethan turned to face her, and Sophie saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "I told her the truth," he said quietly. "That I've been falling for you since the first time I saw you work. That Friday night at the auction wasn't some momentary impulse. It was months of admiration finally boiling over, and that regardless of how I feel about you personally, hiring you was the smartest business decision I've ever made." Sophie stared at him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Ethan." "I know," he said quickly. "I know this complicates everything. I know we work together now. And there are professional boundaries to consider. I know my declaration of love at the auction was probably the most inappropriate thing that's ever happened in Sotheby's history. But Sophie, I also know that I don't want to pretend I don't feel this way about you." Sophie stood up slowly, moving around her desk until she was standing directly in front of him. "What exactly are you asking me?" she said. Ethan's smile was nervous but determined. "I'm asking if you'd like to have dinner with me tonight. Not as your boss, not as the CEO of Brooks Enterprises, but as Ethan, the guy who's been too nervous to introduce himself to you for 6 months until he completely lost his mind at an art auction." Sophie looked into his steel gray eyes and saw sincerity, vulnerability, and something that might have been hope. She thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea: workplace complications, media attention, the vast differences in their backgrounds and bank accounts. Then she thought about the way he'd respected her autonomy when offering her the job, the thoughtfulness he'd shown in setting up her office and lab, and the genuine passion in his voice when he talked about preserving his father's legacy. "Okay," she said. "But I have one condition. Anything. No more public declarations of love until at least the 3rd date. I don't think my heart can handle any more page 6 headlines." Ethan's laugh was joyful and relieved. "Deal, though I can't promise I won't be tempted." As he headed toward the door, Ethan paused and looked back at her. "Sophie, thank you for saving me from that fake painting, for taking this job, for giving me a chance, for everything." After he left, Sophie sat in her beautiful office, looking out at the view of Manhattan that was now part of her daily life, and marveled at how completely her world had changed in the space of 5 days. Friday night, she'd been a struggling freelancer, eating leftover Thai food in a studio apartment. Now, she was the director of art authentication for a billion-dollar company, with a team, a lab, and apparently a date with one of New York's most eligible bachelors. More importantly, she'd proven to herself, and to a boardroom full of skeptics, that she belonged here not because of chance or charity, but because of her own talent and determination. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Saw the news about your board presentation online. Dad and I are so proud of you. Also, are you going to bring this Brooks boy home for Thanksgiving?" Sophie laughed out loud. Some things never changed, no matter how much your life transformed overnight. But as she looked around her office, at the authentication equipment that would help her preserve civilization's memory, at the team members who respected her expertise, at the window that showed her a future full of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine, Sophie realized that change wasn't something to fear. Sometimes, if you were very lucky, change was exactly what you needed. 3 months later, various locations in Manhattan. Sophie Carter had gotten used to many things in the 3 months since she'd started working at Brooks Enterprises. She'd grown accustomed to her morning routine of riding the elevator to the 40th floor while sipping coffee that didn't come from a bodega. She'd adapted to having a team of researchers who actually listened to her ideas and implemented them with enthusiasm. She'd even learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of corporate life, where a casual comment in the elevator could influence budget decisions, and where lunch invitations were often political strategy disguised as friendship. What she hadn't gotten used to was being in love with Ethan Brooks. Not that she'd admitted it out loud, not to Lily, who asked probing questions during their weekly coffee dates. Not to her parents, who called every Sunday wanting updates on her young man, and definitely not to Ethan himself, who had been the perfect gentleman for 3 months of carefully planned dates that managed to avoid paparazzi while still being impossibly romantic. Their first official date had been dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the village that Ethan had rented out entirely just so they could eat linguine and talk about art history without photographers lurking behind potted plants. Their second date had been a private tour of the Frick collection after hours, where Ethan had arranged for them to examine the authentication records of several famous pieces while sharing a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Sophie's monthly rent used to be. By their 7th date, a helicopter ride over Manhattan that ended with a picnic in Central Park, Sophie had realized she was in serious trouble. Ethan Brooks wasn't just handsome and wealthy and charming. He was genuinely kind, intellectually curious, and passionate about things that mattered. He remembered her favorite coffee order, asked thoughtful questions about her work, and somehow managed to make her feel like the most interesting person in any room they entered together. The problem was that their relationship existed in a carefully constructed bubble. At work, they maintained strict professional boundaries. Ethan was Mr. Brooks, she was Director Carter, and their interactions were limited to authentication reports, budget meetings, and the occasional strategic planning session. Outside of work, they went to places where privacy was guaranteed and media attention was minimal. They'd managed to keep their relationship out of the tabloids for 3 months, but Sophie was starting to feel like they were living in a fairy tale that couldn't last forever. The bubble burst on a Tuesday morning in December when Helen Ramsey knocked on Sophie's office door with an expression that meant business. "Sophie," Helen said, settling into the chair across from Sophie's desk with the authority of someone who'd been making executive decisions since before Sophie was born, "we need to talk." Sophie saved the authentication report she'd been working on and gave Helen her full attention. In the 3 months since the board presentation, she and Helen had developed a mutual respect based on shared perfectionism and an appreciation for direct communication. Helen had become something of a mentor, offering advice about corporate politics and sharing stories about the early days of Brooks Enterprises. "What's on your mind?" Sophie asked. "The Brooks Enterprises annual gala," Helen said, pulling out her tablet and scrolling through what looked like seating charts and guest lists. "It's 3 weeks away, and it's going to be the biggest corporate event of the year. 500 guests, including every major collector on the East Coast, representatives from a dozen museums, and enough media coverage to make the Met Gala look like a private dinner party." Sophie had heard about the gala. It was Brooks Enterprises' signature philanthropic event, raising money for arts education and cultural preservation programs. This year, it was being held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with the corporate art collection serving as the backdrop for what was essentially a celebration of everything Ethan's father had built. "It sounds incredible," Sophie said. "The team has been working on special authentication displays for some of the featured pieces." "Yes, I've seen the preliminary plans, and they're excellent." Helen leaned forward slightly. "Sophie, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Are you planning to attend the gala with Ethan?" Sophie felt heat creep up her neck. She and Ethan had discussed the gala, but they hadn't made any official decisions about attending together. The event would mark their first public appearance as a couple, which felt like crossing a line they couldn't uncross. "We haven't decided yet," Sophie said carefully. Helen nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. "Let me be direct with you. For 3 months, you and Ethan have managed to keep your relationship private, which has been beneficial for everyone involved. But the gala is different. It's the most high-profile event Brooks Enterprises hosts, and every major business publication will be covering it. If you attend together, your relationship becomes public knowledge. If you don't attend together, People will speculate about why the company's new director of art authentication isn't accompanying the CEO to an art-focused event. Sophie saw the problem immediately. So, either way, we're making our relationship a story. Exactly. Which brings me to my real concern. Helen's expression softened slightly. Sophie, you've exceeded every expectation we had when Ethan hired you. The authentication program is generating revenue ahead of projections. You've identified over $2 million in collection revaluations, and the fellowship program has applications from students at every major art history program in the country. You've proven that Ethan's faith in you was completely justified. I sense a but coming, Sophie said. But, Helen continued, if your relationship with Ethan becomes public, some people are going to question whether your professional success is connected to your personal relationship. It's not fair, it's not accurate, but it's inevitable. And once that narrative takes hold, it can be very difficult to change. Sophie stared out her office window at the Manhattan skyline, where the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. She'd worked so hard to build credibility in the art world, and the last 3 months had felt like validation of everything she'd sacrificed to get here. The idea that people might attribute her success to sleeping with the boss made her stomach turn. What are you suggesting? Sophie asked. I'm not suggesting anything, Helen said firmly. I'm giving you information so you can make an informed decision. Whatever you and Ethan decide about the gala and about your relationship in general needs to be your choice. But I wanted you to understand the potential consequences. After Helen left, Sophie tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation. She was still distracted when Ethan appeared in her doorway at noon, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the smile that never failed to make her heart skip. Lunch? He asked, settling into the chair Helen had vacated. I brought your favorite. Sophie accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the familiar aroma of Joe Coffee's house blend. Ethan, we need to talk about the gala. Ethan's expression immediately became more serious. I had a feeling this conversation was coming. Helen cornered you, didn't she? She's not wrong about the implications, Sophie said. If we go together, we're making our relationship public, and once that happens, people will assume I hired you because we're sleeping together, not because you're the most qualified authentication expert in the city, Ethan finished. Sophie, I've been thinking about this too, and I have an idea. He pulled out his phone and showed her what appeared to be a press release draft. What if we control the narrative? What if we announce our relationship on our terms before the gala and frame it in a way that emphasizes your professional accomplishments? Sophie read the draft, which positioned their relationship as a partnership between equals who shared a passion for art and cultural preservation. It highlighted her credentials, her achievements since joining Brooks Enterprises, and her upcoming projects. It was tasteful, professional, and completely honest. This could work, Sophie said slowly. But Ethan, are you sure you want to deal with the media attention, the speculation about our relationship, the commentary about your personal life? Ethan reached across her desk and took her hand. Sophie, I've been thinking about this for 3 months. I'm tired of hiding how I feel about you. I'm tired of pretending we're just colleagues when you're the best part of my day. I'm tired of sneaking around like we're doing something wrong when what we have is the most right thing in my life. Sophie felt her heart flutter at the sincerity in his voice. What if it affects your work, the board, the company's reputation? Then we'll deal with it. Ethan said simply, together. Sophie, I love you. I know we haven't said it officially yet, but I've been in love with you since that night at Sotheby's when you stood up and risked everything to do the right thing. I want everyone to know that you're mine and I'm yours, and I want to stop pretending that the most important person in my life is just my employee. Sophie stared at him, her pulse racing. The words hung in the air between them. I love you. Spoken quietly, but with absolute conviction. Ethan, she said softly, I love you too. I've been in love with you since our second date, when you spent 2 hours listening to me explain the technical differences between original Impressionist brushwork and modern reproductions, and you were genuinely interested in every detail. Ethan's smile was radiant. So, we're doing this. We're going public. We're doing this, Sophie said, but I have conditions. Name them. First, we release the statement before the gala, so the event isn't overshadowed by relationship speculation. Second, we maintain professional boundaries at work. No public displays of affection in the office, separate cars to corporate events, and absolutely no special treatment that anyone could point to as favoritism. Third, if this becomes a problem for the company or for my professional reputation, we revisit our approach. Ethan nodded seriously. Agreed on all counts. Anything else? Sophie grinned. Yes, if you're going to be my official boyfriend, I need to meet the rest of your family. Lily doesn't count because she basically adopted me already. I want to meet your mother properly, your extended family, and anyone else who's going to have opinions about your choice in girlfriends. Ethan laughed. Sophie, are you sure you're ready for that? My mother is still recovering from the fact that I declared my love for a stranger at an art auction. Meeting my girlfriend officially might send her into planning overdrive. I can handle Eleanor Brooks, Sophie said with confidence she didn't entirely feel. Besides, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. The press release went out that Friday afternoon, strategically timed for the weekend news cycle. Sophie spent the weekend fielding congratulatory calls from friends, family, and professional contacts while trying not to obsess over the media coverage. The response was surprisingly positive. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece about corporate romance done right, highlighting how Sophie and Ethan had maintained professional boundaries while building their relationship. Art and Antiques magazine featured a profile of Sophie that focused on her professional achievements and her vision for ethical authentication practices. Even Page 6, which had started the whole media frenzy, ran a relatively respectful piece about Manhattan's newest power couple. The real test came on Monday morning when Sophie walked into Brooks Enterprises for the first time as Ethan Brooks's officially acknowledged girlfriend. She'd expected awkward stares, whispered conversations, and the general discomfort that comes when private lives become public knowledge. Instead, she found a bouquet of flowers on her desk from the authentication team, congratulating her and Ethan on making their relationship official. Laura Winters stopped by with coffee and a knowing smile, mentioning that Ethan had been insufferably happy all weekend. Even Helen Ramsey sent a brief email. Well handled. Looking forward to the gala. The Brooks family dinner was scheduled for the following Sunday at Eleanor Brooks's Upper East Side townhouse. Sophie spent the week preparing like she was studying for finals, researching the family's history, reviewing current events that might come up in conversation, and asking Lily for advice about everything from appropriate attire to topics to avoid. Just be yourself, Lily said during their Thursday coffee date. Mom is going to love you because Ethan loves you, and because you make him happy in a way we haven't seen in years. What if she thinks I'm not good enough for him? Sophie asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping her awake at night. Lily laughed. Sophie, you saved my brother from financial disaster, built a successful corporate program in 3 months, and convinced the most skeptical board of directors in Manhattan to approve $1 million budget for art authentication. If you're not good enough for Ethan, then Nobody Island, Sunday evening, found Sophie standing outside the Brooks family townhouse, wearing a navy dress that Lily had helped her select, and holding a bottle of wine that Ethan had assured her was appropriate but not trying too hard. The townhouse was everything she'd expected. Elegant, historic, and probably worth more than most small towns' entire tax base. Ethan answered the door himself, looking handsome in dark slacks and a cashmere sweater that brought out his eyes. Ready for this? He asked, taking her coat. As ready as anyone can be for meeting their billionaire boyfriend's family, Sophie replied, which made Ethan laugh. The living room was elegant but comfortable, with museum-quality art on the walls and furniture that managed to be both beautiful and functional. Eleanor Brooks rose from her seat by the fireplace as they entered, and Sophie was surprised to see that Ethan's mother was smaller than she'd appeared at the auction, petite and elegant, with silver hair and the kind of understated style that only came with generations of good breeding. Sophie, Eleanor said warmly, extending her hands to clasp Sophie's. I'm so pleased to meet you properly. Ethan has told us so much about your work, and I've been following the authentication program's progress with great interest. Sophie felt some of her tension ease. Thank you, Mrs. Brooks. I'm excited to be here. Please call me Eleanor. We're family now. The evening was surprisingly relaxed. Eleanor proved to be an engaging conversationalist with strong opinions about art, politics, and the importance of cultural preservation. Ethan's uncle, William, was there with his wife, Sarah, and they spent a significant portion of dinner discussing the business applications of Sophie's authentication fellowship program. Lily had clearly briefed everyone on appropriate topics because no one mentioned the auction disaster or the media coverage of their relationship. Instead, The conversation focused on Sophie's background, her professional accomplishments, and her thoughts about the future of art authentication. "Sophie," Eleanor said during dessert, "Ethan tells me you painted that reproduction of Van Gogh's Starry Night that's in your apartment. Do you still paint?" "Not as much as I'd like," Sophie admitted. "Authentication work doesn't leave much time for creative pursuits." "You should make time," Eleanor said firmly. "Artists who only analyze art without creating it lose something essential. Ethan, you should set up a studio space for Sophie in the penthouse." Sophie nearly choked on her wine. "Oh, I couldn't." "Of course you could," Ethan said, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "There's plenty of space, and the lighting in the East Wing would be perfect for painting." "Ethan, we haven't even discussed me spending more time at your place," Sophie said, aware that the entire table was listening to their conversation. "Well," Eleanor said with the kind of smile that suggested she was enjoying herself immensely, "that's something you two should definitely discuss. Life is too short to waste time on logistics when you've found the right person." After dinner, Ethan walked Sophie home, even though it meant a considerable detour from his penthouse. The December evening was crisp and clear, with Christmas lights beginning to appear in store windows and the kind of energy that only came with approaching holidays. "That went well," Ethan said as they walked through Washington Square Park. "Your family is wonderful," Sophie said honestly, "though I think your mother is already planning our wedding." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. "Would that be such a terrible thing?" Sophie's heart skipped. "Ethan, I'm not proposing," he said quickly, though his smile suggested he wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. "I'm just saying that the idea of a future with you doesn't scare me. If anything, it's the only future I want." Sophie looked at him, standing there in the glow of the park's streetlights, snowflakes beginning to fall around them, like something out of a romantic movie. 3 months ago, he'd been a stranger who'd made a fool of himself at an art auction. Now he was the man she loved, the person who'd given her a career she'd only dreamed of, and someone who somehow made her feel like the best version of herself. "Ethan Brooks," she said, stepping closer to him. "Are you trying to sweep me off my feet in Washington Square Park?" "Is it working?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her. "It's working," Sophie said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him. "Though I should warn you that I'm not easy to sweep. I'm practical, stubborn, and I have strong opinions about everything from art authentication to coffee brewing methods." "I know," Ethan said, kissing her back. "Those are some of the things I love most about you." The Brooks Enterprises annual gala was held 3 weeks later on a Saturday evening in December that felt like something out of a winter fairy tale. The Metropolitan Museum of Art had been transformed into a wonderland of twinkling lights, elegant floral arrangements, and carefully positioned spotlights that showcased the Brooks Enterprises collection pieces that were on special display throughout the museum's galleries. Sophie had spent weeks preparing for the event, not just logistically, but emotionally. This would be their first major public appearance as a couple, the first time they'd navigate a high-profile social event together, and the first time she'd be introduced to the broader art world as both the director of art authentication for Brooks Enterprises and Ethan Brooks's girlfriend. She'd found the perfect dress, a midnight blue gown that Lily had insisted on buying for her, despite Sophie's protests about the 4-figure price tag. It was elegant without being flashy, sophisticated enough for the venue, and made her feel like someone who belonged at Manhattan's most exclusive cultural event. Ethan picked her up at her apartment. She'd insisted on getting ready at her own place rather than his penthouse, wanting to maintain some sense of independence, and when he saw her, his expression made every moment of preparation worth it. "Sophie," he said, clearly at a loss for words, "you look like someone who belongs on your arm at the Met," she asked, adjusting the simple diamond necklace he'd given her for their 3-month anniversary. "Like someone I'm incredibly lucky to love," Ethan said, offering her his arm. "Ready to make our debut?" The museum was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Sophie recognized faces from art magazines and society pages, along with several authentication experts she'd worked with over the years. The guest list read like a who's who of Manhattan's cultural elite, with a generous sprinkling of celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who supported the arts. "Sophie Carter," called a familiar voice as they entered the main reception area. Dr. Edward Langley, the elderly art expert who'd validated her Sotheby's intervention, approached with a wide smile. "My dear, you look absolutely radiant." "And Ethan, Congratulations on having the good sense to fall in love with the most honest woman in the art world." Sophie felt herself blush, but Ethan's proud smile made her feel like she could handle anything the evening might bring. The first hour was a whirlwind of introductions, congratulations, and conversations about the authentication program's success. Sophie found herself discussing technical analysis techniques with museum curators, sharing stories about recent discoveries with private collectors, and fielding questions about the fellowship program from aspiring art historians. "You're a natural at this," Ethan murmured during a brief quiet moment as they moved between galleries. "At what?" Sophie asked, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. "At being the center of attention without letting it go to your head, at talking about your work with passion but without arrogance, at making everyone you meet feel like they're the most interesting person in the room." Ethan paused beside a spotlighted display featuring the Winslow Homer landscape Sophie had identified and authenticated. "At being exactly who you are, regardless of the setting." Sophie looked around the gallery, at the carefully dressed guests admiring art worth millions of dollars, at the sophisticated lighting that made even minor pieces look museum-worthy, at the subtle signs indicating that Brooks Enterprises had made all of this possible through their philanthropic work. "Ethan," she said quietly, "3 months ago, I was eating takeout alone in my studio apartment, worried about paying rent. Now I'm at the Met, wearing a dress that costs more than my car, discussing authentication techniques with people I used to read about in art magazines. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life." Ethan took her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that felt natural despite the formal setting. "Sophie, this isn't someone else's life. This is your life. You earned every bit of it, the job, the respect, the recognition. The only thing you didn't earn was me falling in love with you, but that was inevitable from the moment I first watched you work." Before Sophie could respond, Helen Ramsey approached with someone Sophie didn't recognize, a woman in her 52nds wearing an emerald dress that probably cost more than a car. "Sophie, Ethan," Helen said with a kind of smile that suggested good news. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Margaret Whitfield from the Smithsonian Institution. She's been following the authentication program's work with great interest." Dr. Whitfield extended her hand with obvious enthusiasm. "Miss Carter, I've been hoping to meet you all evening. We've been watching your authentication techniques, particularly your work on the Moreau attribution that prevented the Sotheby's incident. We're currently reviewing our own authentication protocols, and we'd love to discuss a potential consulting arrangement." Sophie felt a thrill of professional pride. The Smithsonian wanted to work with her not because she was dating Ethan Brooks, but because of her professional reputation. "I'd be honored to discuss it," Sophie said. "The authentication program is always looking for opportunities to collaborate with institutions that share our commitment to scholarly accuracy." As Dr. Whitfield moved on to mingle with other guests, Helen squeezed Sophie's arm. "You see, this is why we knew Ethan's instincts were right about you. Your professional reputation is standing entirely on its own merits." The evening continued with a formal dinner, speeches about the importance of arts education, and an auction of donated pieces that raised over $2 million for the Brooks Foundation's cultural preservation programs. Sophie found herself at the head table, seated between Ethan and a prominent museum director, who spent most of dinner picking her brain about emerging trends in art authentication technology. During the dessert course, Ethan stood to make a speech about the Foundation's work and the importance of supporting emerging scholars in the arts. Sophie watched him command the attention of 500 guests with easy confidence, speaking passionately about his father's legacy and the company's commitment to cultural preservation. Finally, Ethan said, his gaze finding Sophie's across the crowded room, "I want to thank someone who embodies everything our authentication program stands for. 3 months ago, Sophie Carter risked her professional reputation to prevent a fraud that could have cost not just money, but credibility for everyone involved in that transaction. Since joining Brooks Enterprises, she's built a program that's already becoming a model for ethical authentication practices throughout the industry." The room erupted in applause, and Sophie felt tears prick her eyes as Ethan continued. "But more than that, Sophie has reminded all of us why this work matters. Art isn't just about beauty or investment value. It's about preserving the stories that define our civilization and ensuring that those stories are authentic, that they're told honestly, that they're protected for future generations. That's work worth doing, regardless of the cost." Ethan raised his champagne glass, and 500 guests followed suit. "To Sophie Carter and to the principle that some things matter more than profit margins. The toast was thunderous, and Sophie felt overwhelmed by the recognition, the respect, and the genuine affection she saw in the faces around her. But mostly she felt overwhelmed by the love she saw in Ethan's eyes as he looked at her from the podium. After the formal program ended, guests moved back to the galleries for dancing and continued conversation. Sophie found herself separated from Ethan by well-wishers and professional contacts, but she could see him across the room, equally surrounded by people wanting to discuss business or simply congratulate him on the evening's success. "Sophie," called a voice behind her. She turned to find Charles Whitmore, the CFO, who'd been skeptical during her board presentation. "Charles," she said warmly, "I hope you're enjoying the evening." "Very much, Sophie. I wanted to apologize for my questions during your board presentation. I was concerned about the financial implications of creating your position, but I have to admit that you've exceeded every projection we discussed." Sophie smiled. "No apology necessary. You were doing your job, making sure the company's resources were being used wisely. I respect that. Well, you've certainly proven that Ethan's investment in the authentication program was one of the smartest decisions he's made as CEO." Charles paused, looking around the crowded gallery. "Sophie, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you think you would have taken this job if Ethan hadn't made that declaration at the auction, if you'd just been contacted through normal professional channels?" Sophie considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I don't know. I might have been too intimidated by the corporate environment, too worried about whether I belonged in this world. Ethan's unconventional approach to offering me the job forced me to consider possibilities I might not have had the confidence to pursue otherwise." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "So, in a way, his impulsive declaration at Sotheby's led to exactly the outcome Brooks Enterprises needed." "I suppose it did," Sophie said, laughing, "though I wouldn't recommend public declarations of love as a standard recruitment strategy." "No," Charles said with a grin. "I think we'll stick to more traditional approaches for future hires." As the evening wound down, Sophie found herself standing with Ethan in the museum's great hall, watching the last guests saying their goodbyes and the staff beginning the subtle process of cleaning up. The gala had been a tremendous success financially, socially, and personally. "So," Ethan said, loosening his bow tie, "how does it feel to be officially part of Manhattan's cultural establishment?" Sophie leaned against his shoulder, suddenly exhausted from hours of being on for hundreds of people. "It feels surreal. 6 months ago, I was nobody. Special. Tonight, the director of the Smithsonian asked me to consult on their authentication protocols." "Sophie," Ethan said seriously, "you were never nobody special. You were always exactly who you are tonight. Brilliant, passionate, principled, and completely irreplaceable. The only thing that's changed is that more people know it now." Sophie looked around the great hall, with its soaring ceilings and classical architecture, then back at Ethan, who was watching her with the same expression of admiration she'd seen in her tiny apartment 3 months ago. "Ethan, can I tell you something? Anything. When you declared your love for me at that auction, my first thought was that you were completely insane. My second thought was that I was probably going to fall in love with you too, and that terrified me more than anything." Ethan's smile was soft and wondering. "And now?" "Now I know that falling in love with you was the best thing I've ever done. Not because of all this," she gestured around the museum, encompassing the gala, the success, the recognition, "but because you see me as I am and love me anyway. Because you challenge me to be better while accepting me exactly as I am. Because you make me believe that I deserve all the good things that have happened since that crazy night at Sotheby's." Ethan pulled her closer, and Sophie could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of champagne and museum air. "Sophie Carter, I love you. I love your integrity, your passion, your stubborn insistence on doing the right thing even when it's difficult. I love that you make me want to be worthy of my father's legacy. I love that you turned my life upside down and somehow made everything make sense." They kissed in the great hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, surrounded by priceless works of art and the lingering magic of an evening that had cemented both their professional partnership and their personal future. 6 months later, Sophie stood in the same Sotheby's auction room where their story had begun, this time as a bidder representing Brooks Enterprises in the acquisition of a significant collection for the museum's new contemporary wing. Ethan sat beside her, officially there as CEO, but really there for moral support as Sophie navigated her first major auction as Brooks Enterprises Director of Art Authentication. The piece they were bidding on, a genuine Rothko that Sophie had spent weeks authenticating, was approaching its estimated value when Ethan leaned over and whispered, "Whatever happens, please don't announce your love for anyone else in this room." Sophie tried not to laugh out loud. "I'll do my best to contain myself." When the gavel came down on their successful bid, Sophie felt the same rush of accomplishment she'd experienced during the board presentation, multiplied by the knowledge that she was contributing to something larger than herself. As they left the auction house, Ethan took her hand. Any regrets about that night 6 months ago? Sophie thought about her tiny studio apartment, her financial struggles, her uncertainty about her professional future. Then she thought about her corner office, her authentication lab, her team of researchers, and the man beside her who'd seen her potential before she'd fully recognized it herself. "Only one," she said. Ethan looked concerned. "What's that?" Sophie grinned. "I regret that I didn't get to see the look on your face when you realized you'd just declared your love for a complete stranger in front of 200 people. Ethan laughed, the sound echoing off the Manhattan sidewalks as they walked toward their future together, a future built on authenticity, integrity, and the kind of love that was worth any amount of public embarrassment. Because sometimes, Sophie had learned, the most imperfect moments create the most perfect beginnings. The end.